Good morning. I don't know how many of you have trekked to the east side to the Arts District and been to Hauser Wirth and Schimmel, but just by way of a little bit of background, it's not just a gallery. It's actually a compound of multiple buildings that houses museum-scale exhibitions. It has robust public programming. There's an education lab for events. There's a research room. There's a courtyard, public gardens, a restaurant, bookstore. It's really become kind of a cultural destination in the Arts District. And I personally fell in love with the space because they have live chickens in the gardens, and they had a pierogi truck in the courtyard when they opened up. Where I should say now there's an enormous Louis Bourgeois sculpture of two spiders mating in the courtyard. So anyway, seriously, the Arts District, since it opened about 6 months ago, has really elevated a neighborhood that was already exploding with cultural and commercial development, and it really put it on the international art map, the neighborhood. And I guess my first question for Paul, for you, is I know that Hauser Wirth and Schimmel looked all over the city for a space on both sides of the river, in the Wilshire Corridor, parts of West Hollywood. Why did you decide the downtown LA Arts District to set up? What about the neighborhood?
I should say that both for Ivan Wirth and Manuela Wirth, the Arts District was always their first focus. They were long familiar with it because of artists like Paul McCarthy in the Box, and I think some 4 or 5 years before we even started this enterprise, they were showing me a piece of property in that area. It just seemed obvious in terms of both proximity to really leading cultural institutions. You have SciArc, most notably kind of anchoring, sometimes beyond good sense, for 20 years, the Arts District. Of course, the TC, the Geffen Contemporary, and MoCA, and then I think maybe most importantly, the stability that downtown in the visual arts has achieved with the commitment that the Broads made to move their foundations. So it was always a matter of looking in a way against it, looking across the river versus being in the Arts District, looking over to Wilshire. And I'd like to say, oh, well, it was purely kind of strategic and political, but like I think with the best things, it was really the space. And there was nothing that we saw that came even close to the beauty and kind of unlocked majesty of this industrial institution here in Los Angeles, the oldest mill from the 1890s up until the post-World War period.
And for anyone who's wondering, when we talk about the Arts District proper, we're talking about sort of the eastern edge of downtown LA from 1st to about 7th, and it's continually pushing out, and from the river to about Alameda, formerly industrial warehousing neighborhood that's just really exploding right now. So of course the million-dollar question that I wonder is, with its high-rise condos and its $6 coffees, is the Arts District a place where artists can afford to live anymore, do you think? Sort of
I rather suspect that the $6 coffees and the kind of extraordinary boom in restaurants and bars, hotels, and an increasing kind of matrix of both for-profit and not-for-profit spaces really came to a large degree after it became a little too expensive for artists to live in, and that's in some ways a shock that it took so long. I remember first being in the Arts District when I moved from New York to Orange County in 1981 and being at a party at David Amico's house and meeting Mike Kelly, and we're looking out over the warehouse district, and I'm thinking, oh, well, this is going to be the next Soho. Who knew that every other city in America, from St. Louis to Chicago, obviously the Bay Area, and so many, Minneapolis kind of rediscovered its warehouse district in a way before Los Angeles. It's taken an extraordinary amount of time, and it ultimately had everything to do with a younger generation, a generation that's in their 20s and 30s, moving in and being able to live and work spaces. So the development itself has given it the vibrant character that it now has.
Though now the Arts District is considered kind of one of the hippest, trendiest areas, the public murals, the legacy of artists living in the warehouses, the spaces available, the architecture lends itself. But also with that kind of gentrification, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the sort of big commercial ventures like Soho House is now moving into the southern edge of the Arts District. There's a big multi-use complex called 6 a.m. that's 2 high-rise hotel towers with offices and apartments and shops, restaurants, a 3,400-car garage. So my question, I guess, is with that many people, with that much foot traffic coming in, is that a good thing for Hauser Wirth and Schimmel, a commercial gallery, or does it dilute the character of the neighborhood that drew you there in the first place?
I actually think the city has to kind of embrace the Arts District in a more kind of comprehensive way. And clearly one of the real challenges has to do with it being a wonderful district for walking and being on bicycles, but how do you get people there? How do you get them safely parked? I know my own experiences with the opening of the gallery, where all of the parking lots in the neighborhood were gouging, and the city itself has real resources that it needs to really put to play in terms of that development. Just relying on the parking of these large mixed-use developments, condominiums, it's not enough, and it's not going to help to sustain the broad audience that really is the character of this neighborhood. And yet, you know, each development you take on its own, and I love, for example, that SciArc did manage to maintain this extraordinary sequence of buildings. That was the Santa Fe loading depot, and so I would say, from my perspective, I really privilege projects like our own project, where to a large degree the old Pillsbury Mill has been opened up and brought back to life, but it's still the mill as it was. And I think even the plans for Soho House, I think the newer construction in some ways has had a harder time. In some ways, it's been the most important factor in transforming the neighborhood, but it has not always transformed it in a way which in fact feels fully comfortable or even accessible by the neighborhood.
I guess, do you think that it can get too big, where the neighborhood can't actually sustain, sort of like what you were talking about in the opening with the parking?
Yeah. You know, you have to really compare it to other cities that have wonderful walking neighborhoods. And frankly, how much this city both wants, needs, and deserves places for people to gather and feel a sense of community, their own community. And in that respect, I just think it's really a matter of looking at it very carefully in terms of using resources to connect the Gold Line, which is there, with public transportation, with parking, and do maybe a little more work on the streets.
And lower the prices of coffee, more affordable coffee. I was just thinking in terms of public spaces, you know, public parks and squares and foot traffic walking areas are at a premium in LA. And I know that Hauser Wirth and Schimmel chose the architecture of the space to kind of amplify that. The courtyard and the public breezeway to create kind of a public park between 2nd Street and 3rd Street that you can walk through. Can you speak to how the architecture created a public space?
So From the get-go, we were always looking for a combination of opportunities that were both indoor and outdoor. And it seemed, of course, here in Los Angeles, where the weather is so extraordinary, that to be able to have some kind of outdoor program. The building itself was, quite frankly, a gift. And back in the 20s, when the building was being converted from being exclusively being used by trains coming from the Central Valley down to the Port of Long Beach, they didn't really need loading docks. And in a way, the last part of the complex was to cover over this courtyard. You could see it in the early photos and drawings, and make it a large loading dock. And it's a little bit like last on, first off. And you looked at it and realized that if you open this courtyard, and yes, it's a lot of square footage to sort of turn back to the sky, it was extraordinary because the building itself, and I should say, working with Creative Spaces and Annabelle Zeldorf, they all saw what was obvious, that trains used to run through it. The potential of a breezeway from second to third was really a matter of kind of opening up back to the trains that used to run through the building, and that the courtyard would create an internal space which is both for sculpture, events, performances, music.
Pierogi trucks.
Exactly, as a way that in many ways reflects this project that Ivan and Manuela developed in Somerset, just opening 2 years before we did in Los Angeles, which has, it's kind of a hamlet with multiple buildings, a very large ranch and gardens and beautiful kind of really country pastoral setting, with art and exhibition spaces at the center. And this provided a kind of urban environment which, to all of us who live and work in downtown, is so rare and so needed. And I like to think what's being done over on the Grand Park, over in Pershing Square, and most importantly, the developments along the LA River, all of these things are going to tie together, maybe in a way looking back to a period in which the Arts District was originally developed in the 1890s through the 1920s, when there were the Red Line. I remember this beautiful line drawing of the building, and out in front of it were little trains from the Red Line. And I was sort of thinking, well, it's a return to a kind of sense of community that I think Los Angeles appreciates.
Well, it seems to be working. I was there last weekend, and it was just bustling with people, not just in Hauser Wirth and Schimmel, but the whole Arts District proper, lunching and brunching and public artworks and mural tours. And I just was thinking about the first meal I ever had in the Arts District, probably over a decade ago, on a ramen cart on the back of a loading dock in the warehouse at like 2 in the morning. It was a party. It wasn't very good. And last weekend I had a rosewater and geranium lemonade and half a dozen oysters. And then I got to check out the beautiful Maria Lasnig exhibition that's up at Hauser Wirth and Schimmel. So it's come such a long way. You talk about your early 80s and late 80s experiences in the Arts District. You've had a few. What was it like back then when you were hanging out there?
I mean, it's, you know, downtown is an extraordinary really concentration of creative community, and in that respect, the notion of it as a kind of incubator has very much been there. It maybe hasn't been sort of fully appreciated until its very character has changed, and maybe some of that wonderful kind of grassroots community has been lost, and I think people love the idea of what it was. On the other hand, it's it's already, because of this long and very kind of slow period of gestation, it seems to have roots. It seems to have a sense of place. And I know for us, without drawing as much from other parts of Los Angeles, we've had an extraordinary international audience and an extraordinary downtown audience. With 81,000 visitors for the first exhibition between mid-March and the end of August, it's not only unprecedented in terms of a gallery, but it really is museum-like in the sense of community's participation.
In its physical size as well. It's bigger than Mocha, Grand Avenue, I think, in terms of its physical footprint, 100,000 square feet.
It's comparable in many respects to the other institutions downtown. And one of the things I always felt, I think we always all felt, missed at the Geffen, the TC, which is such a marvelous facility that in many ways changed the entire art world, with Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern and Dia, Mocha's rather visionary commitment to this warehouse space, which has been in many respects for 30 years the heart and soul of the creative community of Los Angeles. Like everything else, it needs more of the amenities and infrastructure that create a sense of its permanence and institutional gravitas, and that's very much true of the whole area. And in that respect, things are changing in a way that one senses Los Angeles pride in what is unique in the downtown arts district and downtown in general.
And one interesting thing, you talk about the character of downtown in the arts district, and there are so many downtowns. You know, there's Bunker Hill and Grand Avenue with Mocha next to Disney Hall or Mocha across from the Broad, which is next to Disney Hall and the Colburn School, Chinatown and Chungking Road with a whole different vibe and its galleries, downtown arts district. I think it's unique to have so many different pockets.
I was just talking in London about a piece that Mike Kelly had made in the late 90s, and it was the fountain from Chinatown that was built in 1938, and it was a kind of a celebration, finally, that there was a Chinese community not nearly as close to the powers of to be as little Tokyo, but it was their own community, and how movie stars from Hollywood came down there, and this fountain wishing well, how it became in some ways the metaphor over the years of this kind of layering of different communities that are there, and in fact downtown is, as you point out, very much a crossroads, and it is obviously where Los Angeles was born, and there is a sense of renewal that maybe is very difficult to do in much more developed and, in fact, expensive urban centers in other cities and even in Los Angeles.
I have one last question for you before we go to a Q&A. You really have your ear to the ground as a curator with artists and the arts community. I'm wondering, as artists move out of the arts district and out of downtown, where, and I don't know the answer to this question, and I cover the art world, where are they going? What frontiers are they pushing into for studio spaces?
You know, for as long as I've been here, I've always marveled at the opportunities that exist in Los Angeles for artists in terms of places to make art. And in fact, I know the schools have a huge impact. I know, of course, the museums and galleries, and most importantly, the artist community itself. But this city is a marvelous place for artists to work, and a sense of what an artist needs and can imagine has been, in a way, renewed and been cutting edge here in Los Angeles than in ways like Paris or New York or more traditional cities have not been able to be. You see artists moving into increasingly major warehouse facilities that are, in Vernon or, out along the 10 corridor. And, when I first started coming to LA, it was Venice. Well, Venice isn't a very inexpensive place for artists. There's a few artists who made a lot of money buying things, but they can't even stay there. They become held hostage by the values there or here in Santa Monica. Los Angeles is an extraordinary place for renewal, and I would say the city is still very much leading the way in terms of what is possible for artists.
I've been hearing that artists are heading into Glendale for studio spaces. There's a place called The Pit that's out there, a gallery that some of them are going deep into the valley.
Look from Azusa out to Glendale, all the way, Sunland. I mean, a long time ago when I was working on Helter Skelter, I at a certain point, it wasn't really deliberate on my part, but I thought, well, how am I going to do Los Angeles sort of now? And it wasn't going to be a Venice show. And I started putting dots at the various artists that I was visiting, and there was, people in Topanga, and there was people out in Sierra Madre, there was a couple downtown. And then I realized, of course, as Gertrude Stein said, there is no there. And that was the kind of beauty that it happens in strip malls and in industrial parks, as it still does.
Yeah. Well, it's exciting. It's exciting to see what's going to happen next there and what other areas are going to pop up around LA, which seems to be constantly evolving in the arts areas. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for trekking out at 10:15 in the morning.